Hello again, we continue our explanation of RDF schema and OWL. We learned before what an RDF schema is, and it's actually a vocabulary description language, and it gives people a way to describe vocabularies and the rest of the stuff that we learned in the last video. I just corrected the example file. It was 41 in the last video, now it's 42. Now we hopefully are becoming familiar with what RDF schema is. It gives us the ability to describe variables, and we describe them with RDF, i.e. in triples, and these triples can be available for querying by Sparkle, just like the data itself. We learned about the doubling core, that's actually a standard set for basic metadata terms, and we saw an example. Now we just want to remind ourselves that RDF schema actually is itself a vocabulary with a schema whose triples declare facts. So for example, we learned that in RDF schema and RDFS, the one we used before, we have a property called label and a property called comment. Yes, so it is actually itself a vocabulary. It has a property called label and a property called comment. Yes. Now, this is similar to what we saw before in the doubling core schema, which, for example, which has the creator as a property. So the RDF schema itself has properties, labels, and comment, just like the doubling core has property creator. That makes sense. That's very simple. I hope that's actually clear. Now, RDF schema, it actually lets us define new classes of resources. So if you remember when we had the example number 42, when we saw that type, we said that creator is of type RDF, is of type property, is of type RDF property. So what that means is, as we explained before, that means that the creator is actually a member of the RDF property class. Yes. And now with RDF schema, we can actually create new classes. So let's have a look at an example from the book, our usual book, which is this one. This one here. Let's have a look at some example. Let's get back to the slide. Yeah. So the example is actually an address book with names and some other information, and the author here is trying to create, or is going to show us how he can create two classes for the address book. One class is called musician, and one class called musical instrument. So let's have a look at the code and try to explain it. Now the address book data looks like this, or data set looks like this. We have a prefix AB for learning Sparkle /ns address book with our usual way of creating prefixes. I keep repeating it just to make sure that everyone understands it fully. And then we have triples, some individual, some ID. He has a property first name value Richard. Remember, between double quotes, that means automatically it's actually a string. Last name, postal code, city, all of these properties. Now we'll have a look at how classes can be created for that address book. Well, what we can do here is we can use the same prefix for the address book, and then we have the RDF and the RDFS, our RDF schema. And what we say here is we say AB musician. So we have now this subject, we name it musician, and we say it's of type class, RDFS class. So the RDF schema, I'm sorry, it has something called class, and we are saying that musician is of type class. Remember that we can say RDF type class, or we can say small a class to say that that's actually is a class. These are exactly the same, to use the a or to use the RDF type. And then we're just adding some more information now using some properties from the RDF schema. RDFS label musician, RDFS comment, and we have some comment, and we can add the language tag as we learned before. And then another class now, musical instrument, with the same prefix, and we're saying here that it's actually of of type RDFS class. So these things are exactly equivalent. The author here is just using the A as I explained before. These two things are exactly the same, they are equivalent. And then here he didn't add any comment, he just added just a label from RDF schema from the RDFS to tell us that this is actually a musical instrument. But this is how we can create a class, by saying it's actually our subject is of type class using the RDF type or the A RDFS class. Back to our slides. Now, of course, we can add a lot more data. We can assign, when we declare a class, for example, we can have a subclass of a class. So we can have, for example, another class here, and we say it's of type subclass of this class. We learn that. You can actually watch that. You will watch my protege tutorial where I show you how to use that using protege tool. Protege, remember this protege tool. You can search that in my list of videos on my playlist. Now, let's have a look at an example. Example number 044.turtle, that turtle file, where the author declares a play instrument property. Now, rather than a new class, he declares a property. Now, properties now, they require a domain and a range. Yes, so they require a domain and a range. Remember this. Let's just have a look there, see how it's done, and then I'll go back to the explanation. Now, the author here, what he's doing is creating a property, saying that play instrument, and he's saying it's of type RDF property. Yes, it's sort of a member of the RDF property class. Again, we can say A, just to repeat myself, or leave it like that, they are equivalent. And then he's adding a comment, a label from the RDF schema. And now, because it's a property, usually properties in our context, they will have domain and range. So the domain is the class that they are coming from, sort of the subject value and the subject value of that property, and the range should always be its sort of object. So it needs a subject, it needs a domain and a range. If I go back to the slides, that the RDFS domain property means that if I use this play instrument property in a triple, then the subject of the triple should be a class of type musician, should be AB musician, or maybe an instance of that class. Yes, and if we use it again, then the range of this property, the RDFS range of this property, or this property, means that the object of such a triple, when I use this property in a triple, the subject of such a triple should be a musical instrument or an instance of musical instrument. Remember that in a triple we have subject, property, object. We have a property now, and the property is this one here, play instrument. It needs a subject and an object. If we define its domain and range from the RDFS as we did here, then the subject needs to correspond to the domain, or the domain needs to correspond to the subject, however you want to understand it, and the object needs to correspond to the range, or the other way around. As I said, I actually explain this when I show you how to create a simple ontology using protege. You can double check in my playlist. Now, remember that when I mentioned that in this example here, we can define even subclasses. Well, if you are familiar with the object-oriented concept of dealing with classes, subclasses, with all the properties and inheritance and things like that, then things can become very, very interesting. This is why I'm going to stop here, and please watch my next videos, because they are very important for you to understand the concept of OWL, of ontologies, of sort of inheritance in our context now, because it's actually slightly different than the way it's done in object-oriented. Please watch those videos, and I'm sure they will clarify a lot of things. Thank you very much for watching indeed, and I'll see you next time.